Welcome back to my channel, everyone. Today we will be talking about homeostasis. Homeostasis mainly involves maintaining internal balance within the body, and we will be moving deeper into the topic and covering the subtopics with respect to the IGCSE 0610, that is the pure biology extended code. This also includes topic from the core syllabus which are there, and I'll mention as I move ahead. This chapter is part of the excretion and homeostasis unit, which come as a combined unit, but I've dealt the excretion topic separately, which was there in my PPT in the previous video, and now I'm moving on to the homeostasis topic. One thing which we need to remember is starting with the word itself. What does homeostasis mean? This term has come often on to be defined in a lot of past exams which have happened, and what are the keywords which are expected. So homeostasis means maintaining the internal environment of the body through various mechanisms which are happening. So the first keyword is maintaining an internal environment which is constant, and that is what the body do. This is a mechanism which they talk about. Usually the questions which come for homeostasis, they expect you to either define or state what homeostasis as a term mean, or they ask you the mechanism which helps you to maintain the internal environment. This is maintained with the help of negative feedback mechanism. For IGCSE 0610, we will be talking a little bit about what the negative feedback mechanism means and what it is. But main thing about homeostasis is maintaining a constant internal environment. Second pointer, through a negative feedback mechanism. Homeostasis, the uses of the process is that it helps the survival of cells. It helps the entire organism to survive in different conditions because they have a constant body temperature, which is one of the example, and that's where the classification of warm-blooded and cold-blooded animals also comes into play, because we as humans have a constant body temperature which is maintained. We are able to survive in different environments and we don't change temperature as compared to the cold-blooded animals. The constant internal environment is maintained by the body for a number of processes. For IGCSE 0610, we will be only talking about two mechanisms which relate to your syllabus. The first one is the blood glucose regulation, that is when you consume something which is high on sugar, how does the body metabolize that sugar? Or if you are less on sugar present in your body, how does the body try to bring it back to the glucose level, which are the basic requirement of the body? And the second topic under homeostasis control, which I mentioned in the previous slide, is the temperature control, how your body tries to maintain a balance to bring it back to the normal body temperature. So the first topic which we come under is the blood glucose regulation. So blood glucose regulation under the homeostatic control basically talks about how glucose levels are maintained at a threshold value or a particular value in the blood, and they should not fall low. Now why it should not fall low? So why is glucose needed in the body? Glucose is needed in the body for the process of aerobic respiration or respiration when we talk about. So this is where the examiners tend to establish a link between the chapter of respiratory system as well as homeostasis. So you should remember the equation for respiration, where glucose is broken down to release carbon dioxide and water in presence of oxygen, also to produce the process to produce a lot of energy. All the cells need this glucose for various metabolic processes happening in your body, such as digestion, movement, to name a few of them. Apart from that, the brain cells in your body or the neurons need a continuous supply of glucose. It is very, very important. If the glucose supply is not given to the neurons, it can lead to massive damage to these brain cells. Coming on to the next aspect of blood glucose regulation is what happens if the blood glucose is higher in the blood. So till now we talked about that how glucose is needed for the process of respiration and energy and how important it is. But obviously if the amount of glucose in the blood is very high, it leads to osmotic imbalance. That's one of your keywords here. When I talk about osmotic key balance, this relates again to the chapter of movement in and out of cells, to the topic of osmosis. What happens is that there is a cell, and outside the cell the blood has a large amount of glucose and less of water. So the cell has more water as compared to the blood outside. By the process of osmosis, the water will move out of the cell to equalize the amount of water. So the water moves, I'm repeating again, from the cell into the blood by the process of osmosis, as a result of which the cell loses a large amount of water. When the water is lost, the cell tends to lose its shape, the cell can get damaged, as a result of which the basic metabolic processes which were to be performed by the cell and the cell organelles are not able to occur, leading to permanent damage of cell. So it is very important that a certain amount of glucose level which is needed by the body has to be maintained. Neither should it go low because it has its own effect, and neither should it go high because that also has its own effect. And as students, we need to understand that we should be able to answer questions in both the scenarios. They tend to ask, so please read carefully whether they are asking about blood glucose level falling low or blood glucose levels going up. So blood glucose regulation mainly involves the role of pancreas. The pancreas are the ones which are involved in producing two sets of hormones, that is glucagon and insulin. Each one of them is actually produced depending upon the kind of condition which is there, that is whether the blood has large amount of glucose in it, or the condition of low glucose which is actually there. Obviously, the presence of insulin, which is secreted by the pancreas, it lowers the blood glucose. However, glucagon raises the blood glucose. How it does that is what we are going to study as we move on to the next slides. Coming back to the pancreas, pancreas is a gland, as I mentioned in my previous slide, which is involved in blood glucose regulation. It produces hormones. Pancreas is a gland which is said to have two functions, because pancreas also has a role in the process of digestion, where it produces the pancreatic juice and is associated with digestion of proteins, fats, as well as carbohydrates. So pancreas produces the pancreatic juice, which is supplied to the small intestine through the pancreatic duct. However, pancreas has certain cells which are called as the islets, ISLETS. As you can clearly see, I have made it bold. Islets which are present in the pancreas. They are also known as islets of Langerhans. However, islets is a word for which most of the questions will be asked with respect to the IGCSE syllabus we are talking about. These cells are involved in production of insulin and glucagon, the two hormones. So I'm repeating myself again. Pancreas has a dual function, one in digestion and the other one in homeostasis for maintenance of blood glucose levels. Now coming to the process of regulation. As the pancreas is involved in producing the two hormones, insulin as well as glucagon, to maintain the blood glucose level, we are going to move on to study about each of the condition and how the entire process is regulated. So if the blood glucose level rises, that is, let's say if somebody has consumed large amount of sugar, or they have been high glucose levels in the blood because of certain consumption of food which has happened, At that point of time, the islets of pancreas, the islets of Langerhans which I talked about, these cells in the pancreas, they detect the high glucose which is there in the blood. The detection causes the secretion of insulin by the cell. This insulin then moves to the liver. Why does it move to the liver? Because it is from here that the liver absorbs the glucose from the blood. So the blood is traveling through the liver. Remember, whenever the digestion would occur. So if you try and look at a much more simpler way, whenever you eat something which is very high on sugar, is broken down into glucose, the glucose reaches the small intestine from where the absorption is supposed to occur. Now, when the blood has a large amount of glucose which is higher than the threshold value, from the small intestine we had studied that it actually moves to the liver through the hepatic portal vein, and that's how it is actually moving to the liver, right? However, the detection of the high glucose which is there in the blood is already done before the blood reaches the liver. At the same time, insulin which is produced by the pancreas reaches the liver, where the extra glucose is converted into glycogen. So the extra glucose which is there is converted into a polysaccharide, which we had studied in the chapter for biomolecules, where we talked about how a polysaccharide like glycogen is used as storage in case of animals. So it is glycogen which is stored in the liver. I've listed down the steps of how this is happening. As soon as the glucose which is extra converts into glycogen, the blood glucose level reaches normal. However, if we talk about the reverse condition, that is, let's say somebody has been fasting for very long or has not eaten sweet, has been on a diet, as a result of which the glucose level in the blood has fallen down or fallen below the threshold levels which are there. This condition is known as hypoglycemia. This is for your extra knowledge to understand what this term actually means. Here also a process occurs. Obviously the pancreas is the one which will detect the low glucose. This will cause the secretion of glucagon by the islet cells of the pancreas. This glucagon, like the previous one, will reach the liver. There in the liver, the blood is already reaching from the small intestine, and the liver converts the stored glycogen into glucose, because it has been detected that the amount of glucose which is needed by the body, that is much lesser. So more glucose has to be added to the blood. That's when the stores of glycogen are broken down to convert them into glucose which is present in the blood and now can be utilized and moved to places wherever it is needed for the process of respiration. So till now we have talked about how homeostasis occurs, how at different levels the blood glucose regulation can be performed by the pancreas when there is high blood glucose level and low blood glucose level. While I was talking about each of these concepts, I always talked about a threshold value or a fixed value. So here there is where this new term comes into place, and that is called as the set point. What does the term set point means? It refers to certain fixed value for a particular level that has to be maintained in the body. So there's a glucose level which has to be maintained in the body, and that's what is being talked about. Anything above this value is dangerous, anything below this value is dangerous, and that's when the body tries and brings about homeostasis or the process so that it can come back to the set point. So the main function is to detect something which has gone haywire as compared to that of the set point. Like we were just studying about the blood glucose concentration. If it goes very high, if the blood glucose concentration goes very high, it is the pancreas, the cells in the pancreas which detect this high level of glucose which is there in the blood, and this is the detection system which is always in place to make sure that that set point, whether it is for glucose, whether it is for temperature, whether it is for water levels, has to be maintained, otherwise the process of homeostasis starts. To maintain this set point, there is an other term which comes into play, and a lot of questions have been asked on this term, and that is the negative feedback mechanism. The negative feedback mechanism is actually the process where the body is trying to do homeostasis and bring it back to that set point value. As mentioned earlier by me, that when the blood glucose levels are falling, they are brought back to the set point value. When they are higher, they are brought back to the set point value. So this negative feedback loop is the one which is responsible for detecting whatever change has occurred and then triggering the entire process so that it can come back to the set point. Now, why is this called as a negative feedback mechanism? Obviously, it is a feedback mechanism because you're detecting a system and you're giving a feedback to bring it back to the set point value. However, why is it called negative? Because it reverses whatever change has occurred. So if there was high glucose level, it is lowered down. The reason it is negative, because the outcome looks like it is negative from what has occurred. If it was a low glucose level in the blood, the outcome is that it is increased. So it is opposite or negative of what was occurring. That is why this is called as the negative feedback mechanism. The questions which usually come on this topic talk about the feedback mechanism or the mechanism which has been occurring in the body to maintain a set point or to maintain a particular set value which has to be there for your body, whether it is in terms of temperature or glucose. A very common condition which is associated with blood glucose regulation and is part of the IGCSE 0610 syllabus is the diabetic condition. So the diabetes disease is associated with lack of insulin in an individual. So the cells which are producing insulin in the pancreas have died, which can be because of multiple reasons, and research is still going on in the same field. It can be because of exposure to chemicals, it can be by birth, the cells were not developed properly, it can be exposure to certain amount of radiation which can actually trigger this. So what happens in these individuals? Let's say a person is suffering from diabetes and the person decides to eat a large amount of sugar, or decides to eat a big piece of a cake or large amount of carbohydrates. The result is that the blood glucose level shoots up at this point of time. This blood which is carrying large amount of glucose reaches the liver, hoping that this glucose will get converted into glycogen, but there is no insulin which is being produced by the pancreas, so that does not give any order to the liver to convert this glucose. So the glucose remains in the blood, as a result of which the glucose levels rise in the blood. The rise leads to an increased amount of heart rate and breathing, and a kind of osmotic imbalance, because the blood has a large amount of glucose. It can lead to dry mouth, thirst, blurred vision, which are some of the preliminary symptoms, because most of the cells now start to lose their water, because the water which is there in the blood is lesser as compared to the cells. It's like the osmosis process which is occurring in this. This is where the examiners also try to establish a connection between the chapter of osmosis and the process of homeostasis. Coming back to this, as a result of which there is also high glucose present in the urine which is secreted by the body, because the kidneys can only absorb a certain amount of glucose, but at this point there's large amount of glucose which is produced, so not all can be reabsorbed. So it is very common in diabetic patients. If a large amount of glucose is present, there's large amount of glucose which will be there in the urine also. Now coming to the reverse condition, that is when the person who has diabetes starts to fast or has not eaten sugar for a very long time. So at this point, again, the isle cells which are secreting glucagon are able to secrete it, because the diabetic person had cells which lacked production of insulin. However, glucagon is still produced. Now the glucagon produces and reaches the liver, and so does the blood, which has less amount of glucose. At this point, the order is given to the liver to convert the stored glycogen into glucose. However, there is no stored glycogen, because the individual had no insulin which was being produced, so no reserves for glycogen were ever created. So no glycogen reserves are created, even though the order does come to the liver to be able to convert this glycogen to the glucose. At this point, because there is not enough glucose in the blood, proper respiration is not able to happen. The person feels less energetic, feels very weak, and might even faint or fall unconscious. So please remember here, when we are talking about diabetes, there are two different things which happen in each of the conditions because of lack of the insulin hormone which is supposed to be produced by the pancreatic cells. So in diabetic individuals, or the people who are suffering from diabetes, need to really keep a track of their sugar and have to maintain a lifestyle so that they do not suffer from symptoms of problems of high glucose or low glucose presence in the blood. First, coming to how do we detect, so one of them is a very common equipment which is used, which is called as the sensor. This sensor is used to create a small prick in the finger. It's like a small needle being poured, a little bit blood is picked up, and the blood is touched on the strip, as you can see in the diagram, and it gives a count of the amount of blood which is amount of glucose which is present in the blood. It is very, very important to keep a track of the amount of glucose which is found in the blood by the diabetics. The second is the dip test. This dip test is done with the urine. As I had mentioned in the previous slide, the diabetic patients will always have a large amount of glucose which will be produced as a result of excretion, because the kidney can only absorb a certain amount of glucose, and here the amount of glucose which is there in the blood is actually a lot. So the urine will also have a large amount of glucose, and the dip test which is done involves the use of a strip. And when you dip this strip in the urine sample that is collected from the diabetic patient, they are able to give us a color code, and each color code is able to tell us whether the person has normal glucose levels or the person has high glucose levels, so that certain precautions can be taken with respect to that. Now, obviously, when we are talking about a disease which has occurred in a particular individual, we need to understand what cures can be done and what precautions have to be taken so that none of these symptoms which are expected in high or low glucose levels in the blood happen. So most of the people suffering from diabetes make sure they have a very much controlled intake of the carbohydrates. So they are not supposed to eat, or suggested not to eat a big meal. Rather, they are suggested to eat small meals at frequent intervals. Regular injection of insulin has to be taken by these patients. And why? Because insulin is not being produced in the body, so insulin has to be injected from the outside on a regular basis. There are different ways in which the injection of insulin can be given. It can be given multiple times in the day, which is called as the rapid acting insulin, or they can be long lasting insulin which lasts for about a day, so that the person only has to be injected once with the insulin. But each of these kind of action of insulin which is being injected depends upon how severe the disease of diabetes is in case of a particular individual. The second topic which we come on to is the temperature regulation in humans. Till now, we talked about one form of regulation in case of humans, and that was the blood glucose regulation. How it is regulated, diseases associated if there are deficiencies, is all we've actually discussed. Similarly, the temperature regulation is controlled in the humans. The normal body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius or 98.4 or 98.6 degree Fahrenheit. The center for temperature control in this case is located in the brain, and it is called as the hypothalamus. This is also known as the body's thermostat. Depending upon what kind of condition, whether it is high temperature or low temperature, certain mechanisms are triggered in the body so that the temperature can be brought back to the normal. And here our normal temperature, that is the 37 degrees Celsius or the 98.6 degree Fahrenheit, is the set point. So mechanism work in individuals to bring it back to the set point. However, when we are talking about each of the mechanism which occur in this process, the mechanism can be different, such as sweating, shivering, and we will deal with terms such as vasodilation and vasoconstriction when we talk about each one of these regulations. Okay. One of the main organs, like when we were talking about the blood glucose regulation, the main organ which was bringing about the regulation process was the pancreas. However, the regulation of temperature is controlled by the skin, and for our syllabus we need to understand what are the different components of the skin which help in regulation of this temperature in case of individuals. There are different parts of the skin, and the labeling of this diagram is very important. I've actually picked up this diagram from one of the books which teaches the curriculum. A very detailed diagram is given. You have the temperature receptor, which you can see is on the top, which is able to detect changes in temperature. There's the hair erector muscle, which helps in regulating whether the hair should be in an erect position or should have fallen down. Sweat glands, which help in producing sweats. Arterioles and venules are the two new terms which get introduced. Arterioles are the small arteries which are there in the skin, whereas the veins, the small veins, are called as the venules. So when we were doing the transport in human chapter, we tried to understand that there are arteries and veins as the blood vessel, but there are certain smaller versions of these, that is the arteriole and the venule, and there are certain ones which we had also studied were smaller than these, which were called as the blood capillaries. So these capillaries were smaller than the arterioles as well as the venules. The next is the sensory neuron. Obviously, the presence of the sensory neuron helps in the detection of the stimuli from the outside, whether it is touch or something which is hot, and that's what it detects. Pressure receptors, which are found in the skin, help to detect the pressure. The last part which is there are the fat cells. So they are fat cells which are also present in the lowermost part of the skin. The other term for these fat cells which is used is also called as the adipocytes or the adipose tissue. The tissue which is made up of these fat cells is called as the adipose tissue. ADIPOSE is the adipose tissue, and the adipocytes are the cells. ADIPOCYCTES. So adipocytes and the adipose tissue which is made up of these fat cells. Sometimes these terms have come into question, so please be very careful with each of these terms and their function, how they are involved in the process of temperature regulation. When we talk about temperature regulation, the temperature regulation can happen in different ways, and depends upon how the detection has occurred. So let's say the temperature detection receptor which are found in the skin realize that the temperature outside is very cold, the temperature around the air, or if a particular individual is standing in water and the water is very cold. So when the body is exposed to a condition which is very cold, the muscles which are there, the erector muscles are the muscles which are controlling the movement of hair. The hair erector muscles contract. When they contract, the hair actually tend to stand up, or that's when we have the goosebump feeling, is what comes into play when you actually feel cold. Secondly, the metabolism increase because the body has to produce a large amount of heat, so the body metabolism actually increases a lot at this point of time. A process called as vasoconstriction occurs, that is the arterioles, the arteries, the small arteries which are there in the skin, they constrict or they contract, so not a large amount of blood is able to flow through them. And why is this occurring? Because the larger the amount of blood which flows, there will be large dissipation of heat, or the release of heat which will occur. The more the surface area which is exposed, the more the loss of heat. And here obviously, because the individual is feeling cold, we don't want the heat to be lost by the blood at this point, and the body wants to save all the heat which is there. So please remember this term vasoconstriction whenever a question comes for homeostasis and we talk about a condition of a cold weather. Please make sure terms such as vasoconstriction, hair standing up, hair erector muscles contracting are used. These are the few keywords which are expected in your answer. The sweat glands at this point of time reduce their work, not much secretion happens from them, so that whatever heat which is being produced by the body is being able to be conserved by the body, so that the temperature is brought back to the set point of 37 degrees Celsius during this process. Now let's try and move on to the other condition in the next slide, when the body is exposed to a condition where it is very hot. So in this case, when the body temperature is is too hot at this point of time, because the person has been exposed to very hot weather or is sitting in a very hot room, as a result of which the surrounding temperature rises. At this point, the body wants to bring the temperature down. So the hair erector muscles relax at this point of time, and the hair lies very flat. Sweat glands tend to produce a large amount of sweat. And why does that happen? Because the sweat has a lot of water in it, and when the water evaporates from the skin, so a large amount of water is produced on the skin, when it evaporates, it tends to cool it. The arterioles at this point of time supplying the capillaries dilate. So the process which occur here is vasodilation, and it brings more blood to the capillary, so more surface area, as a result of which more heat is lost and the temperature is brought down. The arteriole which are supplying to the sweat glands also dilate. So here the key word is vasodilation when we are talking about when the temperature of the surrounding is very very hot. So we have covered most of the topic, and this is just a conclusion of the homeostasis topic which is there in the excretion and the homeostasis chapter. Why is homeostasis important? Because it is needed for survival and the person is able to adapt. Please remember, we have two type of regulation. We've talked about the blood glucose regulation as well as the temperature regulation. The blood glucose is regulated by the pancreas. Temperature is regulated by the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is like the receptor which is there in the brain which detects. So during the process of temperature regulation, it's like a two-way detection which is happening. One, they are set of temperature receptors which are found in the skin, which we studied, and they are one set of receptors which are found in the hypothalamus. So there is a two-way detection system which is occurring. Similarly, when we were talking about the blood glucose regulation, we had the pancreas which was performing two functions, one of digestion and one of the process of homeostasis. How each one of these is associated in regulating the two processes is very important. Please remember the keywords which have to be written while you are answering questions. Words such as negative feedback mechanism, set point are very important. And when we talk about each of the condition, what happens during high conditions, what happens during low conditions can also come. Make sure that you understand with each of the keywords so that the right answers can be drafted. All the best. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to respond to my video and ask as many questions as you have. Bye.